in a way that don't affect the poorer sectors of the population, or try to affect the least possible, in the least possible manner, the poorer sectors of the population. Because we think that is so important, in the report that I'm mentioning, the special chapter in that report is on working women in the region. And it's not there because we think only because we think the subject of working women is important. We happen to think it is important, but it's there because it has a very direct link to what we're trying to say about the social sectors. It has been researched and it is widely held that that incomes that accrue to working women have a much higher impact on the well-being of families than incomes that accrue to men. Incomes that accrue to women more directly go into childcare, into child nutrition, into education, and into social investment in a much more whole manner than the incomes that go to men. We have right now in the region 40 million women workers. What is a women worker is also a concept that is very highly debated. Many people believe that the way conventional statistics measure working women hides a very large percentage of women who do household work, which is very important work for society, but which is not valued at market prices. We didn't go into that debate. We took standard measurement of women, and with standard measurement of women, we find that in the Latin American regions there are 40 million women, which is an awful lot of women working. And these women are trapped in two very low productivity spheres, because most of the poor working women in the region, and I must stress that, of the poor working women in the region, which happen to be most of the working women in the region, are also women who do household work. And these women are trapped in two very slow productivity spheres, and hence they have very low incomes because of their low productivity work. The household work is a very low productivity because they happen to do it with very low access to water, to sewage systems, to electricity, to fuel, to transport, to daycare centers, to education, to health. And therefore they have to work very long hours to be able to give their families some sort of probably bad quality services within the house. And they're trapped there for very long hours. It is these same women that have to go out into the workforce and find a type of work that produces income to bring back to support the income of their families, and in a very large proportion of families, not to support or to complement, but because it is the only income, because women-headed households in the regions have been increasing in the last number of years. And when they go out to find work in the workplace, that work is conditioned by the very low productivity of work they do in the household, because they have to spend very long hours in doing so. And when they go out in the workplace, where do women work? Poor women in Latin America work. They work in the urban sectors, in the informal sectors, and in the lowest paid sectors of the informal sectors, or in the domestic service sectors. Both very low productivity sectors in many cases. And very low productivity because they don't have access to factors of production. Women in these workplaces have low access to capital, low access to credit, low access to technology, low access to on-the-job training. And when they're in the rural sectors of Latin America, they tend to be concentrated in small-scale farming. Incidentally, small-scale farming in Latin America produces over 40% of the domestic foodstuffs that are consumed in the region, and about half of that is done by women. But also in the agriculture sectors, and even more so than in the urban sectors, women don't have access to factors of production. They don't have access to land, they don't have access to credit, they don't have access to capital, they don't have access to technology. So, in both of the spheres in which these 40 million working women work, they have very low productivities. These women would be over 50 million by the year 2000. And these women are very much in the center of the most vulnerable groups of the region. And therefore, if we want these adjustment processes to not hit the most vulnerable groups of the region, which include children, old age people, and women, we felt that it was very important to signal out that when these adjustment processes take place, and they must take place if we want to reestablish preconditions for growth. It is most important that in the public sector, deficit cuts. Those cuts are made keeping an eye in mind that what has to be maintained is primarily those services that reach lower income groups. I'd like to finish by saying that although the picture that one has seen right now is certainly not a very happy one for the decade of the 80s, right now, at this point of time in the 90s, we have a very different position to what we were observing, say, a year ago. A year ago, the decade of the 80s seemed a lost decade, and many people were very frightened that the decades of the 90s also was going to be a lost decade. There didn't seem to be a turning point. But right now, with the momentum that the adjustment processes have gained in the region, with the fact that many of the countries have begun to effectively control the very disorganized macroeconomic scenarios that they had, there seems to be a very positive turning point for the region for the decades of the 90s. And we say this not only with the optimistic voice of the Latin American Bank, regional bank, but we can say it very optimistically. We heard it said very optimistically with an institution that is not generally quoted as being overtly optimistic, which is the International Monetary Fund. In fact, several weeks ago, in a press conference held in Washington by the people of the research division of the fund, they went through an exercise they had carried out with projections and simulating models, and they pointed out that if the Latin American region continued the course it was on right now, if the adjustment processes continued for the 90s and the 91, after the year 1992, the region could be growing at rates over 4 or 5% a year, in other words, resuming the growth of the 80s. Now, this is just a simulation model, it's estimates, it's figures, but the point that we're trying to make is if the models persist, if there's a continuous policy reform scenario, it seems as if we have indeed reached the turning point for the region, and we can end this regional overview with a slightly more optimistic tone than what has been the thrust of everything else I've told you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take